Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking into the Laken Riley Act,
Yeah.
the very first bill signed by President Trump in his new term.
hmm
It's been a pretty big deal in the news lately, and for good reason, I think.
Absolutely.
It tackles immigration, which is, as always, a really hot-button issue.
Yeah.
Um, and it passed with bipartisan support, which is pretty rare these days.
Very rare.
So we're going to try to unpack the story behind the act, break down what it actually changes, and explore all the arguments kind of swirling around it.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this particular act is that it really puts a face to the immigration debate.
hmm
It's named after Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student from Georgia who was tragically murdered.
Yeah, it's just awful.
And the person accused of her murder was an undocumented immigrant.
Right.
And then President Trump used this case, along with others, as a foundation for his critiques of the previous administration's immigration policies.
Yeah, and you can see how that story would resonate with people. President Trump often talked about what he called angel families,
Right.
families who have lost loved ones due to crimes committed by undocumented immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And he used these cases to kind of highlight what he saw as the real-world consequences of weak immigration policies.
Yeah,
He even spoke directly to Riley's family at the bill signing,
I remember that.
saying that her death was a direct result of the previous administration's cruel policies.
And that's such a powerful rhetorical strategy, right? Connecting this deeply personal tragedy to this broader policy argument.
Yeah.
It really makes you kind of wonder, like, how does this act actually address these concerns?
Yeah, so let's get down to the details.
Okay.
What does the Laken Riley Act actually change?
So, in a nutshell, it expands the list of offenses that can land an undocumented immigrant in detention.
Okay.
Before, detention was usually reserved for those accused or convicted of serious crimes.
Right.
Now, the list includes things that you might expect, like burglary,
Sure.
assaulting a police officer. But here's where it gets interesting. It also includes offenses that might seem a lot more minor,
But like what?
like shoplifting
Cool.
or even just larceny.
So wait, even getting caught shoplifting could lead to detention for someone who's undocumented.
That's right.
Wow.
And that's a huge point of contention for a lot of people.
I bet.
Critics are saying that this provision could actually violate immigrants' right to due process.
Okay, so what is due process exactly?
Yeah.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with that legal term.
Due process is basically this fundamental legal principle that guarantees everyone a fair hearing and the opportunity to defend themselves before being deprived of life, liberty, or property.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it makes sure that legal proceedings are fair and just.
Right.
And critics of the act are saying that detaining someone simply based on an accusation
Mm-hmm.
before they've even had a chance to go to court
Right.
and prove their innocence goes against this very core principle of due process.
That makes sense. It's not just about how serious the crime is, but also about making sure that someone has a chance to defend themselves.
Exactly.
But this act doesn't just affect detention, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I remember hearing something about state attorneys general having new powers now.
You're right. There is another pretty significant change.
Okay.
The Laken Riley Act gives state attorneys general the ability to sue federal officials.
Okay.
So think like the attorney general or even the head of Homeland Security.
Oh.
If an undocumented immigrant commits a crime that harms their state or any of the residents in that state.
So imagine you're an immigrant living in a state with a really aggressive attorney general.
Yeah.
How might this act affect you?
Well, critics are saying that this provision could really tip the scales in favor of detention.
Okay.
It could give conservative-leaning state attorneys general a lot of power to influence federal detention policies and maybe even pressure the federal government to detain more immigrants even in cases where it might not be justified,
Well-
Yeah, it really adds like a whole other layer of complexity to this,
Yeah.
The relationship between states and the federal government when it comes to immigration enforcement.
Right.
And you also have to consider the political climate, right? This act passed with bipartisan support,
I know, that's so crazy.
which is really unusual for such a controversial topic.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
It's tough to say for sure.
Yeah.
But, some analysts suggest that public trust in Democrats on immigration and border issues has taken a bit of a hit.
Interesting.
We've seen polls that show that more Americans now trust Republicans on these issues.
Uh-huh.
And remember, the Democrats, suffered losses in the recent election
Right.
where immigration was like front and center.
Yeah, it was a big topic.
So all of this could have influenced some Democrats to support the Laken Riley Act.
Yeah. I guess it makes sense in that context.
Yeah,
So it seems like the political landscape is shifting, at least when it comes to immigration.
I think so.
What are some of the main arguments for and against the Laken Riley Act?
Well, supporters of the act say it's a crucial step towards ensuring public safety.
Okay.
They argue that, detaining undocumented immigrants who are accused of even minor crimes could prevent them from committing more serious offenses down the line.
So it's more of a proactive measure to protect citizens.
Exactly.
What about the argument about government accountability?
Oh, yeah. That's another key point that supporters bring up.
Okay.
They believe that this act holds the federal government more accountable for protecting citizens
Right.
from crimes committed by undocumented immigrants.
Okay.
That provision allowing state attorneys general to sue federal officials,
Yeah.
that's seen as a way to really enforce that accountability.
So it puts some teeth into it.
Exactly.
So while supporters are talking about public safety and accountability, critics are raising some serious concerns about the act.
Absolutely.
Like, what are some of their main arguments?
Well, aside from those due process concerns that we already talked about,
Right.
critics also worry about the strain this act could put on federal resources.
Okay.
Detaining more individuals, even for just minor offenses, is going to require more funding and more personnel for immigration enforcement agencies.
Which could take away from other important areas of law enforcement.
Exactly.
And wouldn't all these new cases just totally overwhelm the system?
That's definitely a worry.
Yeah.
Critics argue that the costs, both, financial and logistical, could be substantial.
Makes sense.
And there's another criticism that I think is important to bring up.
What's that?
The act seems to rely very heavily on these emotionally charged cases like Laken Riley's story.
Yeah, and I get why that story resonates so strongly with people.
For sure.
But critics are saying that focusing on individual cases might not be the best way to shape policy.
Right. While those stories are undeniably heartbreaking, critics point out that they don't necessarily represent the overall picture. When it comes to immigrants in crime, the data actually shows that immigrants are statistically less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans.
Wow.
So using these individual cases, tragic as they are, to justify broad policy changes could be misleading.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and the act seems to kind of tap into this broader anxiety surrounding immigration.
I've definitely noticed that.
Which was heightened by the record number of border crossings during the previous administration.
Right.
But, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. We can't let fear just dictate policy.
Couldn't agree more.
So it sounds like this act is kind of a microcosm of this larger immigration debate.
It really is.
That tension between security and individual rights.
Exactly, and it highlights how important it is to look at the bigger picture here. The Laken Riley Act is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Right.
And we need to think about the potential long-term consequences, not just for, law enforcement and the legal system, but for immigrant communities themselves.
What kind of impact could this have on those communities?
Well, there's the potential for increased fear and uncertainty within those communities.
Yeah.
Imagine, living with this constant worry that even a minor offense could lead to detention and separation from your family.
That would be terrifying.
This fear could make people hesitant to report crimes or to seek help when they need it.
Yeah.
Or even just to go about their daily lives.
Right. Like that fear can be so paralyzing.
Absolutely.
And it could affect not just individuals, but, entire communities and families.
Oh, for sure. It could create these divisions and mistrust. It could discourage people from participating in civic life.
Yeah.
And the economic consequences could be pretty significant as well.
Yeah.
For sure.
It's a lot to think about.
This act also raises questions about how it will be applied in different parts of the country.
Definitely.
Especially given that provision about state attorneys general. That's a crucial point. We could see this patchwork of enforcement across the country.
Yeah.
With some states taking a much more aggressive approach than others.
Right.
And that inconsistency could just create even more confusion and fear for immigrants.
Yeah, for sure. So with all these complex issues in play, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Laken Riley Act, while, it was created with good intentions, raises some really serious questions about fairness, due process, and the potential for unintended consequences.
Yeah, it feels like we're really just scratching the surface.
Oh, yeah.
This act could have such a ripple effect across so many different areas, like,
Totally.
law enforcement, the courts, the relationship between states and the federal government, and, of course, the lives of immigrants themselves.
Exactly.
What are some of the long-term consequences that we should be thinking about?
Well, one thing that's important to remember is that this act is likely to face some legal challenges. Critics are already kind of gearing up, preparing lawsuits,
Hmm.
particularly focused on those due process concerns that we were talking about earlier.
So the courts could ultimately decide how parts of the act are actually interpreted and enforced.
Absolutely. It'll be really interesting to see how all the legal battles play out.
Yeah,
And, that could take years.
right.
And in the meantime, you have all this uncertainty and anxiety continuing to build,
Yeah.
especially for immigrants who are now living with this possibility of detention for offenses that wouldn't have had them detained before.
It just underscores the need for, you know, clear, consistent, and humane immigration policies.
Yeah.
Like, it's a reminder that these aren't just abstract political debates.
Right.
These are real-world decisions that impact the lives of, millions of people.
Absolutely. The way we address immigration has huge implications for our society as a whole.
Right.
It touches on questions of justice and fairness and security and what it even means to be American.
So as we kind of wrap up this look into the Laken Riley Act, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay, sounds good.
I think the core question here is, does this act, in its attempt to ensure public safety, risk sacrificing individual rights in the process?
That's a big one.
It really gets to the heart of that tension between security and liberty.
Yeah, which has always been kind of a central part of this whole immigration debate.
For sure. And there's no easy answer to that question.
Not at all.
But I think, by exploring these complex issues, by looking at the different perspectives and arguments, we can hopefully move towards a more informed and, nuanced understanding of immigration,
Yeah,
the challenges, the opportunities, and the human stories at the heart of it all.
I think that's really important.
We encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring this issue.
Definitely.
Learn more about the Laken Riley Act,
Yeah.
read about it, talk about it, form your own opinions,
Mm-hmm.
and always remember that behind those policy debates are real people whose lives are being directly impacted by these decisions.
It's so important to keep that in mind.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course. Thanks for having me.